and determine their successes. I think for a lot of the organizations, one evaluation they made immediately was that they didn't have a clear enough crisis communications plan. Some organizations didn't have one at all. Some organizations had gone through a crisis planning procedures and maybe had a notebook on the shelf, but they weren't nearly prepared for an instance like this. For example, one woman that we talked to said when she needed to contact the media, she was handed a list of email addresses in Microsoft Word. I mean, it was completely unhelpful to her at that point. It wasn't an email distribution list. She would have had to sit down and type all these email addresses in. Knowing that you have to be ready to go and knowing what kind of information you need, I think, is an evaluation that most of these organizations are making. And now we know what needs to be in this folder, what context do we need to have, who's our designated spokesperson. And so that's a lot of the evaluation that's going on, is knowing what we didn't do right and what we need to do in the future. It's a year later now. We look back a year after Katrina and try to think about what's been learned by PR professionals in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. A couple of things have happened. One is several of these organizations that we talked to, I know now, have been in the crisis communications planning mode. They have put together more defined crisis plans, updated their media list. Another thing that's happened is professional organizations, networks of professionals in the area, have done a lot of crisis planning seminars and workshops to try to help people be more prepared in the area. And people, I think, have really relied on networks that they have with other professionals and with the media to try to think about, if this were to happen again, what would we do? The networks that we rely on today, cell phones, they were useless after Katrina. You couldn't make a cell phone call to save your life, but you could use text messaging. We all learned how to text message in the weeks after Katrina. So really trying to think outside the box and think, what can we use, what will be efficient? Radio, text messaging, teleconferencing, things that we know will work, even if everything else breaks down. Looking at public relations theory and crisis communications theory, we can go back to the most basic level and looking at Grunig's 4 models of communications, and in a crisis, two-way communications with a feedback coming from your publics is so important. And while you might not have the feedback of time, of being able to wait for people to respond to your message, you can communicate one-on-one with your employees, find out what they're hearing about your organization, what questions they still have answered. So really trying to get feedback and a two-way interaction communication between with your employees and with your customers and other stakeholders is really important. Just putting information out there and not worrying about how it's being received is, as Grunig says, is ineffective for most situations. And so I think theory was very applicable. You can't necessarily be prepared for what crisis will hit, but you can have some things in place, some tools that will help you when a crisis hits. And it may be something a lot smaller. One thing I think a lot of organizations think is they have to prepare for a huge crisis. It could be a really small crisis, just an issue that your organization faces. But the extent to which that you have accurate, up-to-date media contacts and you have the individuals in your organization are able and prepared to speak to the media will really limit your possibility for making a small crisis a big crisis. One thing I've learned as a teacher of public relations students is that we need to put a lot of pressure on our students. They need to be able to write a news release in 10 minutes. They need to be able to work under pressure because they will be faced with situations where they have to work under pressure. You typically don't have a week to write a news release. Sometimes you have 10 minutes. You have to be able to work with deadlines. You have to understand the importance of accuracy. I have students that do internships, and they have a number wrong or a statistic wrong, and they realize once they're out there working in a professional setting how detrimental that can be to an organization. In a crisis, it's magnified. Every number has to be right. Every name has to be right. And you have to know what information you're allowed to put out there and what you're not. So I think our students need to work under pressure. They need to work under deadlines so that they're prepared for situations like these. If PR professionals are in crisis mode and having to deal with the media, researchers need to be in crisis mode and doing research so that they can help those professionals learn from what happened and do better in the future. You know, these professionals, they were consumed by just responding to media requests and internal communications. They don't necessarily have time to research what they're doing and you know, summarize all the lessons that they've learned. That's the role of research in a crisis, and academicians really have to play that role.